Joining us now is Diana Bhutto, an attorney specializing in international and human rights law. She served as an advisor to both the PLO and Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas. She joins us from Ramallah. Diana, thanks for joining us. So there we have it. The Israeli parliament has passed this law which allows for the force feeding of hunger-striking Palestinian prisoners. There has been criticism, as we've heard. That criticism coming from the Israeli Medical Association, for one. In your view, is what the Israeli parliament passing here tantamount to a state authorizing torture?
Absolutely. This is not just the Israeli Medical Association that has come out against force feeding, but also the United Nations has come out and said that this is tantamount to torture. When you think of how these procedures are carried out, you realize exactly how torturous it is. Force feeding is done in one of two ways, either by putting a tube through the nose of the political prisoner, and if the person is moving, then that can be obviously very painful, sometimes causing a puncture either in the nose or in some cases even in the lungs, or it's done through intravenous through the arms. This is in the case of Israel. And in both cases, it can be very painful for the person who's been on hunger strike for a number of days. I think the more important issue is, why is it that these people are on hunger strike in the first place? And it's because they've been held without charge, without trial, without their lawyers even being given the basic evidence as to what they're being held for. And in the case of Mohammed Allan, he's been held since November 1st of 2014, without charge, without trial, and all he's asked for is a simple trial. That's it. He was forced to go on hunger strike, and so I will not be surprised if he ends up dying as a result of this hunger strike.
You mentioned the United Nations. Is this Israeli law a violation of the UN Convention on Torture?
Absolutely it is. And it's not just this law, but all of the other laws that the Israelis have passed that allow various forms of torture to be carried out against political prisoners. While some forms of torture have been ended by the Israelis, the vast majority of political prisoners still come out and claim that they are being tortured by the Israeli military establishment, and this extends as far to children as well. The fundamental problem is that Israel believes that it has the right to carry out torture against Palestinians, to imprison Palestinians, and to do whatever it wants against Palestinians so that it crushes their will to be able to live freely. And what they don't realize is that they one day will be held accountable, which is why people are calling for Israel to be held accountable under the International Criminal Court, so that they're no longer considered to be immune.
What about the Israeli view? The Israelis say that they do this to prevent the deaths of prisoners, and if the prisoners do die, then that, they say, could lead to more violence.
Well, the reason that these people are on hunger strike in the first place is because they're being held without charge and without trial. And right now, there are more than 400 Palestinians who are being held without charge or without trial. If they're really interested in preserving Palestinian life, they'll stop putting people under administrative detention, which is without charge or without trial, and they will stop killing them to begin with. So this has nothing to do with whether they're concerned about life and respect for life. If they were respecting life, then they would respect the dignity of these individuals and set them free, or make them face some sort of a trial, which they're not willing to do either. I think the big issue is that Israel's been allowed to do this for quite some time, and in the 80s, 3 Palestinian political prisoners ended up dying as a result of force feeding. The time is now for the international community to step forward and say to Israel, enough is enough. You have to release these Palestinian political prisoners, and you can't force feed.
Okay, let's take Israel out of the equation for a moment. Do you believe that there are any circumstances under which force feeding is justified? Let's not forget that the United States also engaged in this practice at Guantanamo Bay when prisoners being held there were force-fed.
And they were being force-fed, and they were also protesting the exact same treatment that was happening with them, which was that many of the people at Guantanamo Bay were being held without charge and without trial, simply on suspicion. So I don't want to really get into the ethics of it. I'm not a person who deals with the issue of ethics. I'm not an ethicist. But at the same time, I do recognize that you can't separate out the facts of this case from the other cases. These are individuals who want to be able to resist, who are protesting the very treatment that they're receiving at the hands of their prisoners, and they're not people who want to die. And so this isn't a right to die issue. This is an issue that these people want to live with dignity, and they want to be able to hold powers accountable for the various treatment that has been meted out to them.
There are doctors in Israel who support this law. There is a doctor, Professor Gil Siegel. Haaretz newspaper, the Israeli newspaper, describes him as a leading Israeli expert on medical ethics. And he says, and I'm quoting here, he would be embarrassed by a doctor who'd be willing to see a person die in the name of political protest. What do you make of that?
Well, this is one person's individual representation, but yet the vast majority of doctors who are here and the vast majority of doctors who've had to confront this issue of force feeding take a very different opinion. The Israeli Medical Association has said that they're opposed to this. The doctors at the various hospitals that Mohammed Adlan has been housed at have also taken a different view. And so while you might have one person who says that force feeding is fine, I think that the bigger issue is that this is an individual who is saying that he doesn't want to die. He just wants to be able to live with dignity. Give him a trial, release him, and stop this charade of holding people without charge, without trial, which is a violation of international norms.
Right. The Israelis say they're facing a stark choice here. Doctors who carry out this force feeding face possible international sanction. They face an international boycott if they do this. Yet at the same time, if a prisoner dies, the Israelis say this could lead to more violence.
Well, there's one way to simply handle this, which is release Mohammed Adlan. The fact that they have held him for more than 9 months without charge and without trial means that all of this can be easily done away with. We're not talking about individuals who are on hunger strike because they're opposed to their sentence. We're talking about somebody who hasn't been charged or even tried yet with any crimes. And so if they really want to get themselves out of the mess that they themselves have created, they'll simply release Mohammed Adlan and allow him to live freely. Or they will actually take some evidence and charge him with something. But what Israel wants to do is it wants to have its a cake and eat it too. It wants to continue to maintain Palestinians in this form of detention without trial, without charge, and it wants Palestinians not to be able to protest. And unfortunately, Israel can't have it that way. People want to live in freedom, and they're willing to go all the way to the end in order to secure their freedom.
Okay, let's move on to that other controversial law passed by the Knesset. Our reporter told us about that. That's a law that would allow Israel to jail a Palestinian for up to 20 years for throwing stones. We know that up to 1,000 people are charged in Israel for this. I mean, what do you make of that? Is this proportional justice? The Israelis say, well, they need to stop it in some way.
Well, if it were proportional justice, then they would be meting out the exact same punishment to Israeli settlers who do the exact same thing against Palestinians in Palestinian cars. We've seen time and again that Israeli settlers who end up throwing stones and do worse, who end up torching houses or killing 18-month-old babies while they sleep in their house, that they actually receive no punishment whatsoever. In fact, more than 98% of cases end up in a situation in which nobody ends up facing any form of punishment. So this isn't a question of Israel meting out the same punishment for both Israelis and for Palestinians. It's only designed to quash Palestinian resistance and will not be used against Israeli settlers who do the exact same, in many cases much worse than Palestinians do. The whole problem is that Israel has been allowed to run freely for nearly 50 years, maintaining a military occupation and denying Palestinians their freedom, and at the same time demanding that Palestinians simply be quiet while their freedom is denied. And as we've seen in cases around the world, nobody sits quietly to the denial of their freedom, and Palestinians are certainly not going to be that first case.
Right. You see, the Israelis are framing this as acts of terrorism. Israel's Justice Minister, Ayelet Shaked, said, and I'm quoting here, he said, a stone thrower is a terrorist, and only an appropriate punishment can be a deterrent, punitive, and just.
Yes, this is the same woman who ended up putting a number of posts up on Facebook in which she called Palestinian mothers snakes and called for genocide. So let's put this in its proper political context. This is not somebody who believes in equality. This is not somebody who believes that Palestinians who deserve justice and deserve freedom and equality. This is somebody who believes that Israelis have a superior right to be here and that Jews have a superior right to settle on Palestinian land in the West Bank. So so we're not really talking about a situation of terrorism. What she's really looking at is she wants to crush and quash any political dissent against Israel. And once again, if they're very unhappy with the Palestinian stone throwers, they can very easily end that by allowing Palestinians to live in freedom and ending their military rule. They want to have their cake and eat it too. They want to be able to steal Palestinian land, deny Palestinians their freedom, and they want Palestinians to simply stay quiet about it.
You know, when we look at the broad question of human rights in this dispute, United Nations officials, the United States itself has accused Israel of human rights abuses. But Human Rights Watch, which is a respected human rights monitoring group, also says that Palestinian militants have endangered Palestinian civilian lives by firing rockets from populated centers in Gaza. Is deliberately putting civilians in harm's way an appropriate tactic on the part of the Palestinians? Is it, in your view, a human rights violation?
It's definitely not an appropriate tactic. The problem is that there's really no way for Palestinians in Gaza Strip to defend themselves. We're talking about an area that is twice the size of the city of Washington, D.C., with 1.8 million Palestinians living in it. It's the most densely populated place on earth. And so in this regard, any area that there's any way of carrying out any defensive mechanism is going to be in an area that is civilian, most unfortunately. The problem, however, is that if you look at what's happening in the Gaza Strip, it's been Israel that's been doing the attacking, not the other way around. And so while nobody wants to see the loss of civilian life, and certainly not me, and as somebody who believes in human rights, I think that we have to look at the bigger picture and ask ourselves, who is the greater threat to the Middle East? Is it a country that is using rudimentary rockets that hasn't killed civilians, or is it somebody, a superpower, that actually ends up having the largest weapon cache in the Middle East, as well as a nuclear weapon, being Israel? And I think the answer is Israel.
Diana Bhutto, thanks for joining us.